Well, hello, friends. David Vos here. I hope you're all having a beautiful day. It's a beautiful day here in Oklahoma, and boy, it just feels like spring. The sun is out. I'm very happy. And we've got another amazing broadcast for you today, because if you think we've been getting into it deep with the last series, well, we haven't even gotten, beyond shallow, because there's so much stuff in our history that has been covered over, that is actually known to us if you did any research. But you got to understand that if you put all of the information that we have on a table, it wouldn't fit. It's vast. If you put it in a room, it would be a large room, so large it would cover blocks and blocks. And no person has ever, until recently, had the ability to go through all that information. So it's always been there. Well, pieces of it has always been there, but most of it a lot of it has come forth in the last 100, 200 years. And in the last 200 years, mankind has already been brainwashed to the point where they can't even see straight. You could have all the evidence in the world, just in one book form, just lay it out in the form of a book, and hand it to a Seventh-day Adventist, or one of Jehovah's Witnesses, or even a Lutheran, or a Baptist, or even someone secular. They're brainwashed in another way. They don't believe in Jesus, and they're not going to believe. It doesn't matter what evidence you give them, they're not going to believe in it, because they've been educated by the Jesuit schools, in Stanford and Yale and Harvard. Why, they know better than the facts. They only believe what they're told, because it's not just something that was set in stone. If it were set in stone, they might, well, it is set in stone. That's the good point. But they don't believe in that what's set in stone. They only believe what's come to mankind, the knowledge that we have gotten in the last 100 years by these scientists that claim to know everything. But what we're going to show you is that these scientists have divorced themselves from the truth. And I want to kind of map that out in a way in which we've never done before. I want to find out where all the information went, put it all together, because actually we have this information now. Been coming up out of the earth. We've got books, but most minds can't put all this together because it doesn't fit in with stuff they already were propagandized about. So, if you found a new truth, could you put it into your mind? Okay, a good example. Let's say 30 years ago, you would have told somebody that there was aliens on other planets, that there were beings from other worlds. They'd say you were crazy. You'd say, oh, but I've got proof. Look at this. I found a rock that was a meteorite, and we've studied it. It doesn't come from Earth. They wouldn't care. Oh, that doesn't make sense. You could, no matter what you say, you're not going to convince somebody that there's little green men from another planet if they don't believe in that. So that's what's happened, is the reason that you can't find, well, whenever you put truth on to the world that doesn't know truth, the truth sounds like fiction to them, and they can't grasp it. So that's the situation we're in. Well, as we've said, all of the information that we're studying, science, mathematics, history, music, grammar and letters, geometry, these kinds of things. All of this, and whether the earth was round or whether we revolve around, the sun or whatever, all of this information was known to mankind from the beginning. How could they have known it? Well, if you're a Christian, you believe in the Bible. And all of the ancient texts have the same story. In our Bible, we're given the story of Enoch. We're given the story of Adam. And we're told that Adam was taken to heaven. He talked with God and he was given all this information. And he wrote it all down. But he wrote it down in a very symbolic book that we have today. And as we've talked about in some of the ladies in the series that we've been doing, we've talked about how this was all symbolized as a book that was sealed. And Daniel was told, and John was told to go thy way, Daniel, and seal up the book. And it will be known in the latter days, knowledge shall increase. And so what is the individuals who had this truth, who were they? Well, they were from Egypt and Babylon and Greece. Well, not Greece, actually, but from the more ancient kingdoms, from the most ancient times. We had this knowledge. We said before, Enoch had it and put it in a temple or in a pillar, which the Bible says is a witness of all of this that we're talking about. It's a testimony that all of this has been known, that God came to the earth and took Enoch and 144,000 off the earth. And at that point had a plan to save all mankind. Because all mankind, they're all children of God, and he has to have a plan because they were deceived by this devil. And these there were 9 of these demons that fell, and our Bible calls them Nephilim, and other cultures talk about these Anunnaki, and other cultures have different names, but they came to the earth and they set up government over mankind. And they with the art of murder, they were able to pressure the world, and with the art of stealing and secret societies, they were able to manipulate mankind. Secret combinations is what it's called. And they stole human beings' minds. They persuaded us and deceived us. And mankind got to a place because of that where we were murdering one another. And the earth was ruined. It says that their hearts were evil all the time. And they murdered one another and they ate animals. They began to eat the flesh of animals. And this deteriorated and destroyed the creation. But you see, God does not fail. We were his children. He's not going to I guess I failed, the devil won. So he had to have a plan. So he took this embryo, the seed. Adam died about 1,000 years after he was 970 years. I think it was 930 years after he was created. Just shy of one generation shy of 1,000 years. And his son Seth and Enosh and Mahalalel and Jared and Enoch. These are the 7 first in a line down to Enoch, who was the 7th in line from Adam. Soon as Adam died, they looked to Enoch. They made him their king. And they loved him, and they followed him no matter where he would go. And at some point, because of the evil that was in the earth, the book of Enoch says that there was a plan made to start over, basically. So we're going to bring this great flood, and saved Noah. But before that, they took all the righteous off the earth so that they wouldn't be infected by the evil that was going to go on for another 600 years. And they took Noah and secluded him somewhere. And he was a righteous prophet who was able to do and obey God during that period of time, build the ark, and take his children into the ark and go into the next age. So there's where the plan began. Now, as soon as the water dried off the land, the devil was at his little machinations again. And the first thing he did was he got Noah drunk. And there's this story about Ham seeing his father's nakedness. This has to do with lineages and who was going to rule the world. Because Satan wanted to get another hold on mankind, as he had done before. And God knew he would do that. That's why God had the 144,000 preserved and the 7 angels who were righteous that would minister. They came to minister, and they were the ones who fight the battle with the dragon, and they are the ones who watch over us, because we're their children. We're all Adam's children. And they came back to minister, because the reason for angels is that they minister for those who are to inherit salvation. Those who are to inherit salvation are their children. They came back to minister because they love their children. And it was a plan developed that everybody could be restored and redeemed from this condition that man had fallen into. So as time went on, our Father in heaven, he knew that mankind wasn't ready for knowledge. First of all, as Jesus said, you don't give your pearl before swine. Second of all, because people wouldn't believe it anyway or understand it in that condition. And they would use it for evil. Just as in the modern times when this knowledge was increased and was let out a little bit, guess what they did with it? Well, they figured out some scientific truth and they made a nuclear bomb. And then we had these great wars. So that was reserved for the very last days, the time of the end, when mankind would get so wicked that it would end in absolute annihilation. It couldn't be given to mankind before that. And so there had to be a really good plan for all of this. Because the devil knows he has a short time now, when he's been thrown down onto the earth, and has a short time to deceive the whole world, and it's going to be a battle. In the meantime, Enoch wrote these truths and engraved it into stone as a witness, as a testimony. And it was down there in Egypt, and it's the Great Pyramid, and it's called the Pillar at the border and in the midst thereof of Egypt, because Upper and Lower Egypt is northern and southern Egypt. It would explain why it's saying at the border and in the midst. It's the border of Upper and Lower and in the midst. And it stands as a testimony or as a witness to our Father's love. Because within that pyramid, there is geometry. There's 144,000 stones. It's 490 feet tall. It's 13 acres at the base. It's absolutely level. It hasn't budged. It hasn't deteriorated in the sense that it's no longer level or starting to fall over or anything like that. Yes, there's been some soldiers and armies that have gone down there and they've chipped away at the outside of it. They were so interested in this Great Pyramid, they would take pieces of it because it originally had a beautiful capstone on the top that you see is not there anymore because it was made out of precious metals. So, but that stands as a testimony. It was, all this knowledge then was put into the hands of a priesthood. Now, in Egypt, this is where the priesthood ended up. And there was a city called the city of On. Now, in Sumerian, that's called Anu. Okay, and originally that was Heliopolis. But when the Greeks came down, they named it to On. So that is the city that you find in the Bible where Joseph went down into Egypt and married the daughter of On. This is keeping, because, remember, Anu is our father in heaven. And so Adam is the son of God. And so we have to keep the lineage from that. And this is what the house of God is, or the house of David. David was the king, and it was a prophecy that would go through Judah and then down to David, that the scepter would not depart from Judah until he who comes who has the legal right. So everywhere that there was a nation, remember, as we said, all the nations are the 12 tribes. But those 12 tribes, it was said they would always be ruled over by a lineal descendant of David. So everywhere you go in the world, the royal bloodlines that you've heard about, that's the royal blood of David. Now, there were two royal bloodlines. There was Judah had two sons. They were twins. Tamar, his wife. One of the sons was Zerah, and one of them was Perez. Perez is the line that came down, and we got Jesus. Zerah was the other line, and he had the little scarlet thread tied around his foot. So there's a controversy as to which one's first. So even though the Zerah line had the little red scarlet, in fact, this is the line that's on the throne today in England. It goes back from Ireland and Scotland and then to Britain. And they call them the Red Hands. And they were called the Red Hands because when Zerah was being born, he put out his hand and they tied the red scarlet ribbon around his hand to find out which one it was. So the line of Zerah then was taken out of Egypt before Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. And the line of Zerah, according to history books and the mythologies and the stories that we have from Greece and Rome, and because all of the royal bloodlines, they will go back to the gods. And so the Caesars were declared gods. And this is true of all of the royal bloodlines. Whatever nation you lived in, they were royal bloods. And the king was a son of God. That's what that term means. It means someone who is in the lineal descendants all the way back to King Anu. And so that was the city there in Egypt. And the pharaohs were, the word pharaoh means the house of God. So the pharaohs were the lineal descendants of all of the kings on earth. And the pharaohs were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, I've got to kind of skip over some of that because we've done a lot of that in some other videos, proving that. And we've talked about Joseph, and we talked about these lineages. What I want to get into is something very interesting. Some deeper things that we haven't covered, starting from about the point of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was a man who was born in Macedonia, over in Greece. There were a group of kings. Some of them were called Philip. I think his father was a Philip. Well, he became the king of Greece, and he was a great general, and he went forth and he conquered the then known world. It was probably the largest kingdom that's ever existed. And Alexander the Great was probably, many think, was the greatest general. Aside from, there was a couple of them that they talk about like this. But he was probably the greatest general. He conquered all the way over to the other end of Pakistan, almost to China. And some say even further than that, and all the way up into Russia. All the way around, he conquered Persia, which would be modern Iran, probably Zakistan, and all up and through there, and down through like Turkey into Greece, Macedonia, all the way down probably around Europe and into Egypt, all the way down to Ethiopia, also including Libya, all the way down through Ethiopia and around the entire then known world. There wasn't any other world that they knew of. He conquered it all. And by the time he was only, I think, about 30, I'm not sure how old he was, 30-something years old. He was a young man. He started when he was just a very young man. Alexander the Great was literally a student of Aristotle. So he was not only a great general, but he was a philosopher. So Aristotle was his teacher. He was his pupil. He used to, when he would go out in his campaigns and as a general and win these battles and stuff, he'd come home sometimes and he'd bring Aristotle some birds, because he would study them, and he was studying nature and learning about living things, and he wanted samples from different countries. So they had a pretty good relationship. Well, at somewhere in his 30s, he ended up just mysteriously dying. Now, the story in our storybooks, you're going to find that a lot of our stories are, we'll go by one story that's not necessarily true. Especially in the last, 100 years or 200 years, as I've said, there's more information that's come up. But there's always been kind of more information than what people were led to believe, because the Catholics didn't want us to know certain things. But they used to say that, he just died of some disease or something, or he just had a heart attack or something, He was a young man. Very unlikely. It probably was poisoned. But anyway, came to a very abrupt, sudden demise. At that point, they were shocked, because he was basically almost worshipped by so many people, and they loved him. He held that vast kingdom together, not just by the fact that he was a great general, but also because people loved him. He was a good person. He was a philosopher. So he understood the gentle side of things as well. So at the time that he died, there was no one to take over, except for 4 of his generals. They sort of split up the then known world 4 different ways. One of his generals, his name was Ptolemy. Ptolemy went down and took over Egypt. The other 3, one went up to Macedonia, and one went, east. And the other one took the Babylonian area. But when they were taking the body of Alexander back, Alexander said he wanted to be buried at sea, but they didn't want to listen to his wishes. They wanted to deify him or something. So they took and they built this huge, it almost looked like a Colosseum, but it was really a small version of probably made out of wood mostly. It wasn't that heavy, because somehow or other they were carrying this thing. It was like a shrine, but it looked like a Colosseum. And they carried it across from Babylon towards Macedonia. And they were going to deify him there and make a shrine. Well, right around sort of halfway across, before they got there, Ptolemy went up and sort of ambushed him and took Alexander's body back to Egypt. He didn't follow his wishes either. He made a shrine, of course. But Ptolemy loved Alexander, and he was a very good man. This is another thing you probably don't hear too much of when you're in your school classes and stuff. They don't tell you that Ptolemy was actually a half-brother of Alexander the Great. There's now more and more evidence that supports this, because we found out at some point not too long ago for certain that Ptolemy's grandfather was Philip, which was also So they were half brothers. So that means that Ptolemy was of the great bloodline of Alexander. Now that's important because Alexander the Great was of the great bloodlines of the gods, the royal blood, and from so many different angles. If you go back into history, they will tell you that, Xerxes and Cyrus the Great, who, by the way, in our Bible is called the Messiah or the Christ. And as we've said in other videos that I've done, we can show that Cyrus the Great, as well as Nebuchadnezzar and many of these great individuals, and now, as we're saying, Alexander the Great, were literally royal blood descendants of Judah and King David. One of the ways that this happened is because King David had a lot of wives. He had 700 wives, and his son Solomon had 1,000 wives. And so Solomon had a child with the Queen of Sheba, and that child ended up becoming Nebuchadnezzar. And so this is kind of how it happened. And all of these royal bloodlines scattered around in the world, and they ruled the world. So Alexander was of this royal blood, and this is why they deified these persons. They had the divine right of the kings in those days. But as time went on, these kings, the people got more and more restless, and they didn't want to just worship some man. They were getting, back in the days, these kings were closer to the days where maybe they were even bigger and taller, and they, spoke with gods, and they had maybe they were able to do magical powers, or they could talk behind, maybe like Oz behind the curtain. They had all the levers, and so it was easier to worship these guys. But as time came on down towards the time of Rome, mankind no longer had this supernatural thing going on much. And these individuals that claim to have this divine right, they just seem like people in many cases, like humans. So the people got restless, and they didn't want to worship these kings. So, what things started, more or less, has been evolving since the beginning. As you know, today we have a thing called democracy. We have capitalism. We have a constitution. We don't have the divine right of the kings. And we say this is a step up. We've progressed. Well, this progress has been going on in many ways. And what we're going to do in this video is show how all of this has happened. We go back to Julius Caesar. Most Christians today just assume this was an egotistical guy who thought he was God and probably was a bad guy. And, oh, buddy, isn't this amazing? What you're going to find out about Julius Caesar in this video. I don't know if many of you will be able to hang on after you hear this and listen for a video or 2 or 3, because this is going to go into several videos, so that we can have the opportunity to prove this information. But some of you may immediately hear this and just click off. Some of you may have heard some of this before, and you may be interested in hearing the rest of this. But we have not been told who Alexander the Great is, but we have not been told who Julius Caesar is. As I said, he was of the lineage of the gods through King David, through these lines that go back to the pharaohs. And so what we've got to do is we've got to get these lines of kings down and understand who they are and what is taking place, because at the time of the Ptolemies, something was happening. Remember the other day we talked about Ptolemy, who was this great astronomer who said the earth was round. Well, Ptolemy was in the tradition of Aristotle, like Alexander and his son Ptolemy, or his half-brother. Well, they were philosophers at this point. They may have been God's kings, but they were also philosophers. In the tradition of the pharaohs, who were spiritual beings. You can read some of the stories of the great pharaohs who were religious and spiritual, and through initiation into these mysteries would become like God, not only because of bloodline, but they had to learn these great mysteries. And this is true in our Bible of King David. He became a priest. And he was a spiritual person and had to learn great things. He wasn't, even though he was of this holy bloodline, he wasn't just made king because he was of a certain line. No one even thought he would become king because he was like the runt of the family kind of thing, you know. But he was a musician, and he sang and he did things, and you know, he was short, and he took down Goliath with a slingshot. So he was brave, but he was never necessarily considered the strong, you know. He had generals in his army like Uriah that was almost like a giant or something. But David was just this young man that nobody thought would be anything, but he was a wise man. This is kind of the story that you get, that our ancient scriptures are trying to explain to us, is that we're trying to get mankind to a place to understand that we've got to become wise. And that we're not supposed to be ruling a man or worshiping a man. But these kings that are ruling over us, they go back to Adam. And Adam, because he's the firstborn, that's what gives him the right to rule. So Jesus, when he came, they wanted to make him king, and they put this crown of thorns and mocked him. Problem is at that time, there's so much confusion. People didn't understand. Some of the bloodlines were very proud. And so at that time, Augustus Caesar wanted power. And there's a lot of the story that we haven't been told. There's a reason why Augustus Caesar didn't like Jesus. Not just because he was there was a prophecy, and the prophecy, remember, was that he would be the Messiah, the one born to rule the world. See, and he wasn't just some child that, some nobody that, off in the desert somewhere, never heard of it. No, come on, this was a royal child of the line of David. There's much more to this story than we've been told, and there's much more to this person, Julius Caesar, than what we've been told. Julius Caesar had a child. Well, we don't know if Julius Caesar was the father. But there was a woman named Cleopatra who was the 7th Cleopatra. And she was the reincarnation of Isis. She gave birth to a child she called the son of Isis, which the spelling of that is Isu. Isu means the son of Isis. All right, so without going any further there, because I'm going to save that till later, because we've got some preliminary information to get out before we can get to that. But what we're going to do is show, some of you may have, if you've been on YouTube at all and done any research, you've probably seen Caesar's Messiah. You've probably seen another guy, somebody named Ellis. What's his name? I don't remember names very well sometimes, but there's some theories going around about who Jesus really was. And this has kind of veered some individuals off in maybe the wrong direction, but at the same time closer to the right direction than you might think. Because the identity of Jesus, see, like for instance, if you watch this movie, Caesar's Messiah, while there's a great deal of information in those videos, a lot of what you're going to see in that video is going to be wrong and false information. First of all, the fact that Jesus never really existed according to that video. In other words, they give you all this information just to prove that Jesus never really existed anyway. And then if you look and you watch all the way to the end, you find out that what they're really saying, there's a lot more to it that they start admitting at the end and say, well, yeah, there really was a Jesus. Well, it is, it is prophesied in every kingdom on the face of the earth that this one would come, but there's not really a Jesus. And then they end up saying, and they've changed their mind, this Caesar's Messiah thing. They were talking about Jesus being Caesarian, which was also called Isu, Cleopatra's son. But later on, there's quite a few of these scholars that are working on this, and a few of them had a different idea that he was Titus Vespasian. So they kind of changed their theory on that, showing that they don't have absolute information. They're just guessing on this. So yes, there's good information in these videos. And this Ellis guy's got some information that's interesting, but he's shooting in the dark, and he's going from the point of view that all of this, the Bible's false, and he doesn't have a clear understanding of what the ancient esoteric wisdom really is. So therefore, they wouldn't be able to come to the right conclusion. But what we're going to do in this series is we're going to come to the right conclusion. We're going to find out who all of these individuals are, starting with the Ptolemies, Alexander the Great, and how that line married into the last of the pharaohs and the pharaonic daughter that brought forth the Cleopatra, who brought forth the Son of God, the last of the pharaohs. And how that person, that story, was preserved in our Bible and lost to history because, remember how we talked about the other day about this Merlin? Because during the Dark Ages, all that information got lost. And so the historians didn't have anything to really work on, so they tried to piece it back together. And so for that part of history, we've got myth, because we don't have the actual, either they had to hide it, so they wrote it down in myth, which is the actual truth. Or you might think that they just didn't know, and just made up a myth with a few facts and some of it that they just made up. Well, there's not really anything made up there. Those things that appear to be made up are symbols that hide and also reveal greater truth. Yeah, it's the same way that we have in the Bible, because while most people, historians, think that the Bible is just a myth, they don't think it's history. I know Christians say it's history, but, the secular crew, those at Yale, they just say, oh, that's the Bible, that's a myth. Right? Oh, these silly people believe in that. Well, men wrote that. Testimonies, eyewitnesses. It's history. But you don't trust it, but you trust Josephus, who wrote history. Well, if you trust Josephus, he wrote about Jesus too. But that might have been an interpolation. We don't know. Okay, so you've got two testimonies, and you want to just throw out the one and assume that the other is myth. We're going to show the real truth in this video. It's going to take a while to build all this testimony and give you all the details, but we're going to put it all together. The same thing that we said about how Merlin was a story to give us information about that particular history of that time. There's also that astronomer Ptolemy that's part of that puzzle. He was in about 180, 190. He was in the tradition of Pythagoras and Aristotle. Why? Because remember what we said. All the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic line of kings, there were 15 of them. And the last one, the 15th, was Jesus Christ. All of them were sons of the gods, and lineal descendants through Alexander the Great and through King David. And all of them were philosophers and musicians. And they were wonderful people. When the people in Egypt wanted to make Ptolemy I king, He refused. He said, no, that is not, I don't want to become king. There are others that could become king instead of me. And when time went on and there was wars and something had to be done and the people were looking for guidance, and all of the descendants and the brothers and everyone else that could become king had been murdered or died or whatever, and there was no one left, he finally consented. But instead of ruling people the way they had done in the past with armies, he built the 7 wonders of the world. He built a great library in Egypt so that people could come and learn, and it was free. We get the word museum from the muses, which were the 9 muses of science and arts. And you would go into this, it was like one of the 7 wonders of the world, this place, and it was amazing. It had 700,000 books. And anyone could go. There were dorms where you could live there and just study for free. And he financed it. No matter who you were, if you wanted to study, it was free. Talk about free education, right? Well, he's the one who started it. He was a man who wanted to build his kingdom on knowledge and love rather than exploits. Instead of going out and, like some other kings would go and be generals and destroy and kill and rape and pillage and tax the people, he taxed. He had another way of taxing, but he did tax. But what he did is he made a big lighthouse, and it was like 480 feet high. It was an amazing thing. It started off at the ground floor. I think it was square, and it went up several hundred feet, and then it had another tier which was octagonal, and I think it was octagonal, and then the third tier I think was had, I think, 6 sides. I'm not sure. And then there was a light at the top which was kept burning, and they had this sort of a metal thing behind the flame that they could turn, and you could see that light for 200 or 300 miles, and then they made this huge shipping port, and all the world would come there because of this great light, which is in the tradition of the Statue of Liberty with the torch. And that's this progress, this liberty that we're still progressing towards. In fact, we're going to talk about the face that's on that Statue of Liberty. Who was that person? We'll do that. We'll cover that in another video because it's a beautiful thing. You can prove who that Statue of Liberty really is. And what the course of history, the direction that we're going, the purpose. Because many of you are probably thinking there's no point to the world. It's just we're all going to end in destruction and death, and the devil wins, and nothing ever gets better. Oh, you don't have any idea how much better. We've gotten a constitution, and women vote, and it's illegal to buy and sell slaves, and the Emancipation Act. We have all these things that are progressing, and we're in the dawn's early light. There's a point, there's a purpose, and our Father has a plan. And it goes back to these successive governments. So we're going to cover all these lines of kings and all these people, and we're going to find out what happened, what the true story of Jesus is, the real history that's in our Bible. But it actually says that Cleo is there in the Bible, calls her Mary. Cleo is just short for Cleopatra. All this is in our Bible. We're going to show it. We're going to find out who Joseph of Arimathea was. We're going to find out who John the Baptist was. Who that Ptolemy of the 2nd century AD was. And how that led to Newton. Because they had to piece it all back together. Because remember, the Catholic Church destroyed that Alexandrian library. Burned it to the ground. And there isn't even a trace of the Alexandrian library today. 700,000 books. There's not even a trace of it on the earth today. Nobody knows where it went. Well, yes, we do. We know it was razed and burned and completely destroyed by the Catholic Church. And so therefore, the world went into great darkness. But our Father always had a plan. Because when one thing was happening over here, our Father had a plan over here. When the Catholic Church was the Spanish Inquisition in 1492, there were those who were getting on ships and coming over to America and establishing a constitution of liberty and justice for all. A place for the pilgrims to come and be free. And truth keeps marching on. So yeah, it's a very beautiful thing. So, there's a plan, and it's interwoven throughout history. As Christians, I think we've been told a lot of things that just weren't true. And it's kind of stopped us from being able to learn. We think that all the kings were they were usually all bad, and we just think that the world's always bad and everybody's evil. And it's hard for anyone to think that maybe Julius Caesar was a good person. Well, Julius Caesar was murdered. The Senate murdered him because they tried to make him king too, and he wouldn't do it. Remember the story in the Bible where they tried to make Jesus king, and then they mockingly put the crown of thorns on his head because he wouldn't accept the kingship. He said, "My kingdom's no part of this world." Well, that is our Bible expressing to you a great truth of actual history. Something that actually happened in history that we're being shown in the Bible, a historical truth. The only difference between, well, there isn't any difference between the Bible and historical truth, except that we have versions of history that sometimes use another name. But most of the time, our Bible, it's not like it's not willing to use those names. Like we said, Cleo or Cleopatra is in our Bible. It's just history. Why would it surprise you that Mary was an actual person? All of the scriptures, the history tells us. The ancient infancy gospels and all these manuscripts that we've got from the very first century tells you that Mary was a priestess. Remember, Cleopatra had several children. One was Caesarion, or Isu, son of Isis. One, his name was Helios. That means the sun. And he had a twin named Selena. That was the moon. Selena ends up being governor of the area down by Libya. And we're going to tell you some beautiful things about who those people were. There was one other child that was born to Cleopatra whose name is the twin, Thomas. And so in our Bible, we have an interesting thing. We have a man named James, who was the brother of the Lord, and we have a man named Thomas, the twin, sometimes called Judas Thomas. And we have the book called Jude, who is the brother of the Lord in the Bible, and the book of James. James was the head of the Ebionites. Remember the Therapeutae? They were connected to the Ebionites. They were two communities of the same belief. The Therapeutae were the follower of the Coptic Christians that go back to the Pharaohs and go back to the Ptolemies and taught the teachings of the Christ before Jesus was ever born on the earth. It was called Serapis Christ. And Serapis Christ was the worship of the lineal descendants of God through the Ptolemaic line. Because remember what we said, Ptolemy would not become king until it was there was no other thing he could do. Because his nation needed guidance and direction, and they demanded that he become king and help them and govern them because they needed help, because there was armies coming down from Rome. And so he went up to the Isle off of Greece. I think it was the Isle of Rhodes, and they were being destroyed by the Romans. And he went up there with an army and saved them. And they called him Soter, or Savior, from that point forward, which was actually a title bestowed on. They didn't just name him that out of the blue. They gave him the title because they in other words, they pointed it out. They said, that's the Savior. He got recognized at that point. It was a title that was given to Serapis Soter as well. And that was this lineal descendant of the pharaohs. Now, the picture that you see, Serapis Christos, that you'll see, which was put on all the coins at the time, is the exact picture that you see everywhere today in all these churches. That's a picture of Jesus. That's where we get the picture. And that's the picture of Jesus. It's on all the coins. And that is the line through Judah. And when he became king, the only way he would do it is by scriptural means. In other words, spiritually, to be a real king, an actual king, you must, according to the Egyptian and the ancient esoteric wisdom, you had to marry into the lineal line going back through the pharaohs of the woman. Not only the man had royal blood, the woman had to have royal blood back through, just as Joseph did when he married the daughter of On, or Anu. So he did the same. And so he married an Egyptian native. Remember, Ptolemy came from Greece, so he was a Grecian. Just before he went down there, they had some wars with the Persians. The Persians had a line of kings down there too, from Cyrus the Great. But the woman that Ptolemy I married was a native Egyptian woman, a black woman. And that is the line that gave us the Christ. And it is something that the Christian church today has no idea. There's so much information that we've got to discuss. They were doing the little communion. They had the bishops. They had the whole church. The whole system that we have today in the church was being practiced long before the first century. And so there's a lot of history that we've got to get caught up on so that we can figure out what really Christianity is. Because we know that the church today is apostate, and they've told us a lot of lies. And then today we've got all these modernists that say that none of this is real. It's all, Darwin, was evolution. There's no God. There's no direction. We've got no hope. We don't know what to believe. Jesus wasn't real. That's what they said the Antichrist would come and say one day. Is that, this is how you know if when the Antichrist comes, he's going to say that Jesus isn't real. He didn't walk the earth. So, it's pretty serious, and we got to find out for sure. Look, I wouldn't want anyone to believe in anything just because the Bible said so. Just because some book said so. But what we do want to see is the fact that we've got all of this history that confirms as a witness testimony, eyewitness testimony of all of this stuff. And the actual eyewitness testimony is going to literally explain and put it all together so that we can see it fits. Because a lot of things that Christians are telling people, because they misunderstand the Bible, it really doesn't make sense to people. And so You've got to have more than just a testimony in one book. You've got to have all testimony agreeing. You know, I mean, if you've got 1,000 testimonies that say it's not true, and then one that says it is, well, then something's wrong. Truth is going to be truth no matter where you find it. So if Jesus is really the Christ, we're going to find it in all the history books. We're going to understand this history, not just that it happened, but that there's a purpose for it, who these guys are, what was their point, what's the path of civilization forward, who are we, will we live forever, is Christ really going to come back to the earth and establish his kingdom? And then there's a lot of other little things that we're going to learn along the way, whether the earth is round or flat. I know that seems to be a very important question for a lot of you, even those who watch my channel. We're going to show how the ancient pharaohs believed the earth was round, that this was that this ancient wisdom was handed down to the pharaohs and then on to the Ptolemies. And how this ancient teaching was about Osiris and Isis and their son Horus, which is about the resurrection, which is about the Misa, which is about the Greek way of saying it, the Christos, or the Serapos Christos, which is the teachings of Horus and Osiris. And Osiris was the grand king or pharaoh. And we're going to tie that in with the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and show that they lived in the land of Goshen for 400 years, and they were the pharaohs. And there were 3 of these dynasties. And in the 3rd dynasty, the last pharaoh was married to the Ptolemy I, and then therefore the last reigning pharaoh wasn't a man, it was Cleopatra 7. And she was quite a woman. And so we're going to talk about her exploits. Oh my goodness, she was an amazing, amazing woman. She defeated armies. She was, I think, the most amazing, not only woman of history, but perhaps the most amazing person of history. Aside from our Lord Jesus Christ, of course. He was a person in history. You know, but the exploits of Cleopatra is just absolutely amazing. And if you didn't have confirmation from other historical records, and then you add to it the stuff that's in the Bible that we didn't even know was about her, and she gives birth to this Christ, and how she preserved and sent her son to India for 17 years. We're going to talk about the triple tier temple there at Alexandria. We're going to talk about how Mary Magdalena is the Selena. Remember we talked about how Cleopatra had 2 children. They were twins. One was Helios and one was Selena. Selena means the moon. Well, Selena, that's Jesus' sister. When he came back from India, he found her and they reunited. And it was the tradition, because in the holy bloodline had to be pure. Remember, just as Abraham married his sister, a royal wedding. So Jesus married his sister Selena, which is Mary Magdalena. The Magda was added as a title onto Elena. That was her name. Depending on what nation or language you speak, it could be Elena or Selena. But it means the moon. And that is the princess who went into France and made the Merovingian kings. There is so much that we've got to cover. This could be, I don't know how many in a series to get through all of this. We're going to we started a little bit there with Alexander. I gave a kind of an overview to whet your appetite. We're going to start back there in Egypt tomorrow, talking about Alexander and his half-brother, Ptolemy I, and how he married into the native races there in Africa and was anointed and became the Holy Christos and how that came down to Jesus. And from there, we're going to trace it throughout the world. So I'm going to go ahead and go, friends. Hope you guys have a really great day. This is David Vos. We'll see you again tomorrow. Have a good one.